Right guys, welcome to dmartinphotography.com on YouTube. Today we're going to be doing a Lightroom basics tutorial. This tutorial is aimed at beginners, those that haven't downloaded Lightroom yet, that are considering downloading it, or those that have downloaded it and haven't got a clue where to start. What we're going to do, we're going to cover the basics of importing an image. I'm going to go through all the panels and show you what everything does. Then I am going to fully process the image that I'm importing and export it and show you the before and afters. So the first thing we need to do, we need to open Lightroom. And now I'm going to press Shift and F twice to make Lightroom full screen, just so I get a bit more of a bigger picture. Next we need to import an image. You can do this a number of ways. On a Mac you press Command Shift and I. On a PC you press Control Shift and I. If you're uncomfortable with shortcuts, you can just come to the top, you press File, press Import Photos and Video. Now you need to locate where your image is. In this case it's in a Lightroom tutorial SD card that I've got plugged into the Mac. And this is the image that I want to import. Now on the right hand side, these are all your import options. So custom text, we're going to call it Lightroom demo. Your start number is the number of the image that's going to be imported. So for example, you're importing 5 or 6 images and you press start number 1, it will call each one of them LR demo, and then it'll add the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. going through your images as you import them. You develop settings and metadata, we'll cover this in another date. Right, now we need to choose where we want it to go. In this case I've called a folder Lightroom demo, and I want the folder to be created in my pictures folder. Now that's done, we press import. Now once the images have been imported, you'll end up in Library. Library is where all your images are stored, so you can actually see in a tiled view like this, or you can just generally browse your images. On the left hand side here, these are all your folders. In this case we called it Lightroom Demo, and that's the folder the images have been put into. Right, on the right here we've got our histogram with all the settings that we shot the image at. As we scroll up and down here, we've got all our metadata and information and copyright information that we can add into the image. All this information that you're going to add, for example a caption, your copyright information, all of that will be embedded in the image when you finally export it. Now we need to go into the develop module to actually start processing and editing the picture. We can do this a number of ways. We can either press D on the keyboard, or we can come up to the top and press develop. Now we're in develop. This is a raw image, it has no settings applied to it, it's got no camera settings, this is nothing at all, it's completely flat. On the right hand side here we've got our histogram, which shows you our blacks, shadows, exposure, our highlights and our whites. Underneath that we've got different tools. This one is your cropping, this one's spot removal, this one's red eye removal, this one is a grad filter, this one is a radial filter, and this one is an adjustment brush. Again, we're going to cover them in a later date, and a few of them I'm going to be using towards the end of this video, show you what they actually do. In the basic panel, this is your basic processing. At the top we've got our white balance. We can manually adjust it ourselves, or we can use one of the presets. So custom is what we would have just done, doing it ourselves. We've got all different presets here for different situations. A lot of the time auto works very well, and then you can fine-tune it yourself. I'll press auto just to show you an example. I'm going to come back out of that so it's raw again. Underneath that we've got exposure. Exposure is how you exposed. So if you move it to the left it gets darker, you move it to the right it gets brighter. Your contrast is your whites and your blacks. It also adds a bit of saturation in there. So if we move the contrast, as you can see, a lot of the blacks and the whites disappear. If you increase the contrast, more blacks, more whites are added, but it also includes saturation into the image. So you have to be careful of how much contrast you use with a headshot like this. Your highlights are all your highlights in the image. You can darken them or lighten them. I'll give an example. If you look at a skin, there's a lot of highlights there. So we can remove them highlights if we wanted, or we could increase them. Your shadows are all your shadow areas in the image that aren't blacks. For example, you've got shadows here all around her neck, shadows under here, a couple of shadows around the button, and a few shadows in her eyes. So we can make them lighter, or we can make them darker. Your whites and your blacks are exactly what they say on the tin. They are your whites and blacks in the image. So the white slider, if we move that down, you'll see all the whites starting to fade out, so they become a very, very light grey rather than white. If we move it to the right, it increases the whites, and the same goes for the blacks. Clarity is your micro contrast. Increasing the clarity can give your image a little bit of punch. Decreasing it, it can make the image a lot softer. So if you wanted to make a girl's skin softer, you could paint some clarity onto a skin. It just generally softens it out and removes some of the harsh contrast in the midtones. Your vibrance and saturation is exactly what it says on the tin. That increases your vibrance of your image, how vibrant your colour is. For example, if you can look at her hair, it's all orange. If we move the vibrance right up, it really gives it a bit of punch in the colour. And the same goes for saturation, but these are global adjustments. This happens to the whole image rather than sections of the image. Again, for example, your tone curve, right, we're going to cover this at a later date because your tone curve is quite complex. I'm going to give you an example. Let's get rid of this saturation again. I'm going to give you an example of the tone curve. You can put points on the tone curve and adjust this area here. If we look at the top here, the shadows and the blacks, that's what this area is in the tone curve. So as we're lifting it up, we're lightening them, and now we can give that more of an old cinematic sort of film effect that you used to get sort of on Polaroids. That's just over the top. So again, yeah, we'll cover the tone curve at a later date because it is quite complex, especially the fact that you can adjust your red, green and blue also. Your HSL is your hue, saturation and luminance. Hue is the characteristics of each individual colour. For example, a hair here is orange and we've got red here. If you look to the right of the red, it shows more orange. If you look to the left, it shows red. Here it's in the centre, it's what you see at the moment. But if we move it all the way to the right, it adjusts all the reds that are in the image and makes them more orange. Again, if we move all the way to the left, it adjusts all the oranges in the image and makes them more red. This happens through all the colours going down. So you can fine tune any image with any colours exactly how you want. Underneath that we've got saturation. Again, it's very similar to hue. You can adjust the saturation of each individual colour. Like the saturation slider above, that was a global adjustment which adjusts the saturation of that entire image. This one, you can increase or decrease the saturation of individual colours within the image. Again, for comparison, because her hair is so orange, I can show you that now. We can make all the oranges in the image more orange, or we can pretty much remove them. The same goes for all the colours. Luminance is how bright or how dark your colour is. For example, again, orange. Moving the slider to the left will make all the oranges darker. Moving the slider to the right will make all the oranges lighter. This is very useful with skin tones, especially if someone's got blemishes. This young model, she's absolutely gorgeous, no blemishes at all, so I can't really show you an example. But generally, someone with blemishes, I move the red slider slightly up. As you can see in the image now, it's smoothing out all the skin. It's taking a lot of the red tones out of the skin. Underneath that, we've got split toning. Split toning, it's where we can put two different tones within an image. For example, here we've got highlights and we've got shadows. Your highlights would be all her skin here, her eyes, her lips, all the lighter tones within an image. Your shadows are all the darker areas that aren't black, and you can add two different colours into an image. I'll show you here for an example. The highlights, we can add a bit of orange into it, and the shadows, we can add a bit of blue. In this case, I'll make the blue a little bit stronger. I'll show you the before, well that's after, and there's the before. It just adds two different colours into an image, so you can completely customise any raw file exactly how you want. Sharpening and noise reduction. This is a panel that you have to be careful with, especially for beginners, because a lot of people tend to over sharpen their images because they think it looks great. They may be looking at it on a 720p screen, they may be looking at it on a standard definition screen, but you can't over sharpen your images. What you want to do is, once you've zoomed in 1:1, you can adjust the sharpening, and you want to do it a little bit at a time. Here, the amount is how sharp the image is going to be. As you can see, no sharpening, it's a standard. Moving it all the way up, it does sharpen the image, but it also increases noise. Your radius is where your sharpening is applied. In this case, it's been set to 1 pixel, so every pixel will be slightly sharpened within the image. If you set it to 3 pixels, it'll be every 3 pixels is sharpened. Again, I like to leave the radius small because the bigger the radius, the more artifacts are included into the image, as you can see now. Your detail is how much detail is kept within the image. It adds small grain into the image. I'll show you an example. If we've got the sharpness on 70, see all that there? That is the detail that's been added. No detail, lots of detail. So again, you want to be careful with the sharpening. I'll go through that when I fully process the image of how I like to do it. Noise reduction is when you've shot an image at such a high ISO like 3200 or 6400, you get digital noise that's included in the image. Noise reduction can reduce that, it smoothens out your image, but at the same time you lose a lot of quality within the image when you use too much noise reduction. Now that's zoomed in at 2:1 there. Luminance is how much, I don't know why they call it luminance, that's just how much noise reduction is added to the image, but as you can see, the more we increase it, the smoother the image gets. Your detail is how much detail is kept. How much detail is kept within the image when you do apply noise reduction. The same goes for contrast. Your colour, detail and smoothness. This is when you get colour noise. If you shoot at a high ISO, you tend to get little droplets of colour that are all over the place. Little bits of red, a little bit green, a little bit of blue. This tends to be applied to RAW files rather than JPEG, as most cameras correct this within the JPEGs. So how much colour needs to be adjusted, the detail you want to leave within the image when you're applying the reduction, and how smooth you want it to be. Lens corrections, this is an interesting one. Every lens has its problem, even the best lenses in the world has its problem. This can correct everything generally within a lens. Most imports I tend to leave enable profile corrections, remove chromatic aberration and constrain crop. I tend to leave them turned on so it does it automatically for me. Lightroom is loaded with lots and lots of lens profiles. So say for example you're shooting a 14mm lens and you've got distortion, you can enable profile corrections, you can click profile and you can select your lens. A lot of lenses are loaded into their database. If it's not loaded in there, leaving it at default will not automatically select it for you, so you have to go in there and select it yourself. Or you could just go to manual and adjust the final outcome yourself. Colour is where we get chromatic aberration and fringing. When you're shooting a high contrast image, a lot of lenses, especially cheaper lenses, tend to get small purple and green lines around areas of high contrast. This is where you can remove the chromatic aberration and you can adjust these sliders here, which will help get rid of it. For example, if I had all purple lines around here because it was such high contrast, I'd leave remove chromatic aberration on and I'd move the slider up a little bit until they've gone. Finally, we've got effects. Effects, I tend to only use post-crop vignetting. I very rarely use grain unless it is an effect that I want to add to an entire bunch of images. But a vignette is a darker area around the edge of your image. As you can see, I'm adding one now. Or you can lighten one, make it white. The amount is how dark it is going to be. So all the way to the left it's very dark, all the way to the right it's very white. Your midpoint, you can see where your midpoint's adjusting. That is where the area of light actually starts and where the darkness ends. So as you can see, I'm moving it left and right and it's adjusting it. Your roundness is this area here. As you can see, it's quite oval at the moment. So if we move the roundness, you can adjust exactly the shape that you want. Feather is how much it fades off. As you can see, it's quite a dark line here and it fades out slightly into the image. Feather, as you're moving it down, it doesn't feather at all, then it's perfectly round. As you're moving it to the right, as you can see, all the darkness fades in slowly, so that thick black line won't be there anymore. Move it to the right, and now it's black that fades purely into a dark grey. Underneath we've got grain. That's exactly what it is. You can add digital grain into a picture, and you can add the size, the roughness, the amount, exactly how you want. But some people like it, some people don't. Finally, a setting that I very rarely touch unless I'm shooting with Fuji, we've got our camera calibration. Each camera has settings embedded in it, lens profiles, like portraiture, landscape, etc. A lot of people use Adobe Standard. When you shoot a Fuji X-T1 or many Fuji cameras, you've got different profiles actually embedded in here as well that you could also use that help simulate classic film looks. For example, classic chrome. This is a somewhat representation of Kodachrome film. I think that's the look that they tend to go for with it. As you click it, it fully adjusts the image. Or we can go to Pro Via Standard, which was quite popular, and it adjusts the images again. I tend to use Pro Neg High with all my edits. I'll go back to Adobe Standard. Right, now we've gone through the entire panel. I'm going to edit this and show you what I do to an image, and then we're going to export it. Right, so the first thing I want to do on this image, I want to correct the colour before I start adjusting anything else. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to come over to As Shot and go to Auto. I want to see what effect that it actually gives me. Now I've clicked Auto, I think that has made it just a little bit too cool for my liking. So I am going to move that up slightly until I see a colour that I think is about right. Right, the temperature is about right. Now the tint, I'll maybe add just a little bit of pink into there. Right, the exposure, I think I exposed a little bit too bright, so I'm actually going to bring that down a little bit. Now for me, I think that's looking a little bit better. The details back in the skin and the details back in the hair. Right, the contrast, I always like to add a bit of contrast into an image just to give it a little bit of punch. There we go, right. Now the highlights, I think I'm happy with the highlights, and the same again with the shadows. The whites on the other hand, I wouldn't mind boosting the whites a little bit. Top tip here, if you want to actually see what whites are being applied to the image, you can hold Option on your keyboard and press whites, and you can move all the way up till you see whites in the picture, or get rid of your whites. In this case, I'm going to come up, there we go, I can see a little bit of white in the picture. It's a little bit too much, but at least I've got a solid white point. I'm going to do the same again with the blacks. I'm going to hold down the Option key, I think on a PC it's the Alt key, and you press blacks and move it down so you've got some acceptable black points in the image. Well, I think that's nice now. We've got plenty of blacks, plenty of contrast in the image. Now we're going to go to clarity. I always add clarity into absolutely everything. Even if it's only 5%, I always add a little bit in. Right, vibrance, I think she's quite vibrant as she is already, especially with the orange hair. So I'm not going to add no vibrance, and nor am I going to add no saturation. I'm going to come to tone curve last. Right, the hue and saturation. The reds, I think I'm going to make them a little bit more orange rather than red. And the saturation, I think I really want to pump them up a little bit. Not sure how much yet, but we'll see. Right, I think that gives a lot of oomph to the image now. There's a lot of colour in there. My hair really stands out, really starting to pop from the picture. Luminance, I don't think I need to change anything. I don't want to make anything darker or lighter. Right, split toning. I like to add split tone into an image. I think it makes an image stand out a little bit more than the average Joe's image. So I think highlights, let's have a little look around here. Oh, that's where I want it to be already. And let's have a look at the saturation for that. I think that might be a little bit too much. So let's bring it down a bit. And now the shadows. I'm going to come into the blues again. And we're going to add a little bit more this time than the standard, and to balance out the colour a little bit. Yeah, 25. Yeah, there will do, I think. Right, I think I'm happy with the split toning. Now the sharpness. Although I am happy generally with the settings that are applied within Lightroom, the standard settings, Fuji RAW files tend to need just a little bit more. Sharpness, I always zoom in 1:1 so I can have a look. Most cameras, especially my Canon system, I stick to around 40% sharpness, whereas in this case, it being Fuji, I'm going to bring it up a little bit to 70. Radius, I'm always going to leave at 1. What I found with the Fuji X-T1 files is we always need a little bit more detail than other cameras. So in this case, I'm going to add, let me have a quick look. There, I think I'm going to stick to around 59, whereas on my 5D Mark III, I tend to stick around 20, maybe 25. Masking. Masking is the area that it's being sharpened. So if you hold down the Alt or Option key again, and you click masking, all the areas that are in white, the sharpness is being applied to. If you move it to the right, as you can see, areas start to be masked out, so it's only the white areas that sharpness is being applied to. If you move it all the way up to the right, it'll only sharpen the areas that you can see on the screen. Whereas I still like a little bit of sharpening all over, but I don't need sharpening inner skin and in the background. So I think I'm going to go for around maybe 35. Let's have a little look at that. I think I'll go for a little bit more. I think 40 will do. Right, noise reduction. I did shoot at ISO 1000. A little bit of noise has started to creep in. So I'm going to add a little bit of noise reduction in there. The detail, I still want plenty of detail being left in there. Contrast, I'm not so fussed about, but I always include a little bit. The colour detail and smoothness. In this image, I don't really need it, but if I look closely, a little bit has been introduced, so I'm going to move the colour up slightly. And I'm going to leave the detail and smoothness as standard. Lens correction. I shot this at 56mm. On a crop sensor, that's the equivalent of around 84mm, so there isn't really much distortion, so I am completely happy with how that image has turned out. Chromatic aberration, I always leave that turned on just in case. Right, now effects. Pretty much all my images, unless it's a white background, I like to add a little bit of a vignette to. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to drop the vignette all the way down with the amount so I can see the exact area that I'm going to be adding a vignette to. So now the midpoint. That's a bit too much. Let's have a look. No, I think there's about right. I'm happy with how the shading is all around the edge. And now the roundness. Yeah, I think that's about right. And now feathering. I don't want it to feather too much, but I don't want it like this either, so let's move it up a little bit until I think I'm a bit comfortable with it. That I'm now happy with. Highlights introduces the highlights that are behind the area that you've darkened. See this here, it's all black. If there were any highlights around here, like on a shirt and on the top of a head, increasing the highlights brings them back. So I always like to do that just a little bit, just so not everything's not darkened. Now I'm quite happy with where that is. I want to adjust the amount to something believable. There we go. I'm going to show you the before and after. Before and after. Right, I still think that might be a little bit too much. Let's try that. Before and after. Right. Yeah, I'm definitely happy with that. Camera calibration. I always use Pro Neg High for the Fuji X-T1. It just gives a little bit of oomph to the picture. It desaturates it slightly and changes the colour slightly to something which I prefer. Right, now we're starting to have a pretty usable image now. Now, just to finish this image off, I am going to press K on the keyboard, or you can press the adjustment brush, which will adjust particular areas. For example, the center across her face, if I wanted it brighter, I can move that all the way up and make it brighter. In this case, I want to adjust the highlights. We're going to have the brush set here. And I'm just going to adjust the highlights slightly in her face. And now you can see what the highlights do. So I'm going to adjust that till it looks somewhat real. Now that I am happy with. I think I'm going to add another brush, this time to her lips. And add a bit of punch to her lips. Now that I'm happy with, and now I'm going to add a little bit of punch to her eyes as well. So I'm going to bring the exposure all the way down just so I can see exactly what I'm painting, or you can press O on the keyboard and that will give you a red line, like so. I prefer to see where I've been painted by the exposure. Right, now that's all her eyes selected, I think I'm going to add a little bit of clarity to her eyes. Bump the exposure up slightly. A little bit of saturation. And I think I'm going to drop the shadows a little bit. So far, there's now, and there's before and after. Right, I think there may be a slight bit too much contrast in the image, so I'm just going to take that out a little bit, and I'm going to drop the highlight slightly so it's in her skin. And now I do see that there are a few blemishes in her skin here, so I'm going to come down to luminance and I'm going to brighten up the red slightly. But as you can see, it's a global adjustment to the reds all over the image. Now you've got a couple of areas here where there are a few marks on her skin. If you wanted to remove them, you can go to spot removal, and then you can click over the bit that you want to remove, like so. Now looking at the image, it still looks a little bit blue, so I'm just going to increase the temperature slightly. I'm going to add a little bit more magenta into it. And finally, although I added a little bit of clarity into the image, which has added it to the eyes, to the lips, to the hair, I'd like to remove it from the skin. So I'm going to go to brushes again and move my exposure all the way down just so I can see exactly where I'm painting, and now I'm going to paint over her skin. Removing it from areas that I don't want to remove the clarity from. And now I'm going to drop the clarity slightly, which will smoothen the skin out just a little bit more. Then we'll drop the exposure by 1. Let's have a look. Oh, here we go. And there we go. That's the final image. I'm happy with that. So here's before, and here is after. Again, before and after. Right, now to export the image, you need to come all the way over to the image. Command and click if you're on a Mac, or right click if you're on a PC. Go to export. All these are all presets I've got set up for certain export settings, which we'll go into in a later date. You click export, and now I'm going to set this for Facebook, for example. So my Facebook upload preset, scroll down, now your image set to JPEG and the color space set to sRGB. My quality, I always have it a little bit further down, just because Facebook prefers smaller files than it does larger files. But if you was exporting this at full res, you would leave that slider all the way up at 100. If you was exporting this at full resolution, you wouldn't have this checked. If you take it off, that'll export at the full size. For Facebook, I set it at 2048 pixels across the long edge and my resolution at 72 pixels per inch. This is kind of the standard for web upload, especially to something like Facebook or Twitter. Otherwise, if you're exporting at full resolution, you would leave the resolution here at 300. Sharpening, I've already added sharpening into the image. I don't need to add any more. So I always keep my sharpen 4 and then have it on low. This improves the compression and the sharpness when exporting. It's not adding anything extra. Watermarking, you can add your own custom watermark here. Myself, because I've been photographing for a long time, I have had lots of different watermarks over the years, so there are many in here. I'm going to choose one of mine at the moment. There we go. And after export, you can choose what you want to actually do. Most people tend to leave it at do nothing, or you can show the image afterwards, or you can open in Photoshop. Finally, you need to choose where you want your picture to go. So we're going to put this into a subfolder. This goes into a Lightroom exported folder, which I tend to use all the time, so I know where all my images are going. And we're going to call this YouTube Demo Export. Now that is done, we click export. And there we go. I'm going to press Shift and F so I come out of full screen. And now I'm going to go down to Finder, which in Windows would be your start menu. And then I've got my shortcut set here. I'm going to come down to YouTube Demo Export. And here we go. This is the final image. Right, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you found it useful and want to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button, as more content will be coming soon. Next, I plan on doing a more in-depth tutorial on Lightroom and going into depth with a full process and edit rather than just covering the basics. If there's anything else that you'd like to see, leave me a message in the comments. If there's anything particular you want to let me know about the video, again, leave me a message in the comments and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. Once again, thanks for watching and see you soon.